Siman Zayin of Choshen Mishpat, which is section 7. We're getting into some of the more juicy topics now. And by juicy topics, I'm referring to who is invalid to officiate on a Beit Din and why. So I want to try to hit three topics now. The first topic is the invalidity of converts. That's topic number 1. Topic number 2, the invalidity of women to serve as dayanim. And number 3 is slightly more on the philosophical side, but it is nonetheless brought in the halachic literature of the qualities that we are meant to seek out in the people that are serving this function. So let's just jump right in. I'm sharing my screen. People can see the sources over here?
Yeah, can you make it slightly bigger?
Can I make it slightly bigger? Let me see. Having some difficulty enlarging it. Well, we'll do our best. Let me see, hold on.
If you can't, you can't.
Yeah. Okay, fine. So we'll skip that for the time being. So this is source number 1. Source number 1 is the Gemara in Yevamot. It says Amar Rava Ger Danas Chavero Dvar Torah, that a convert is allowed to judge a case if the litigant is a convert. Shneimar, as it says, Som tasim alecha melech asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha, you will place upon yourself a king. Mikarav achicha tasim alecha melech, from amongst your brothers you will place upon yourself a king. Okay, alecha hu debainan mikarav achicha. So we see that that a person that the appointment needs to be from amongst your brothers. Aval ger danas chavero ger. However, if the litigant is a convert himself, it's permissible for the dayan to be a ger. Now, just off the bat, there's a question that stands out over here. The proof text that the Gemara brings that a dayan is invalid is the pasuk relating to a king, as it says, "Mikarav achicha tasim alecha melech." You will put yourself a king from amongst your brothers. So this already highlights a very, very important point, which is going to be a running theme. I think in general we've realized that there's a lot of overlapping themes that really it's very, very difficult to have any understanding at all, let alone a deep understanding, without having multiple concepts that we're holding simultaneously. And that's why we're trying to do our best to explain each concept somewhat independently as we get to it. But this is a very, very important idea, and the idea is that the position of a dayan is this melding of two types of leadership roles. The first type of leadership role is like a semi-political role, meaning it's a position of authority. It's not political like a policy maker, like a person who's sitting in the Senate or the Parliament and deliberating over policy decisions, but political in the sense that they have authority. They have political authority. They are able to use force if necessary in order to mete out certain decisions. So that's one side of the dayan role. The other side of the dayan role, which we will actually discuss in a moment, or at least bring it up because it'll be important, is the teacher of Torah role. The dayan is an amalgamation of the authority figure and the teacher of Torah. So the fact that the dayan has this role of not just someone who's teaching Torah, giving over the halacha, but someone who's also giving over authority. He has an authority position. So this text involving a king is actually very, very relevant. And as the Gemara says in a few places, kol simos sha'atasam alecha, any application of authority that you put upon yourself must be from amongst your brothers. So it's not just a king like the specific position of a king, which, as we've said in the past, the king and the court system are two very, very distinct, let's say, branches of authority in the construct of the Torah. Yes.
I think there's Gemaras that refer to even appointing someone sort of in charge of the waterworks.
Correct. Exactly.
Stuff that any position of authority.
Yes. That's the same. That's the same source that I'm referring to. It's kol simot shatasam alecha. Any positions of authority that you place amongst yourself have to be from amongst your brothers. Now let's just.
But it seems a little unfortunate because if he'd be the best guy for the job,
yeah.
I mean, wouldn't you want the best surgeon, the head of the surgery department, rather than a bunch of others who happen to have a lot of malpractice suits on them? And then to say, I can't use him because he's a convert.
Right. So it's very good that you brought.
So
it's very good that you brought that up. It's very good that you brought that up. So let's lay out the logic for this. First of all, you gave the example of a surgeon, someone who their role is very, very practical, meaning we have them in order to fulfill a certain service. We want the surgeon to be able to cut people up and sew them back together as best as possible. The plumber, we want them to be able to fix the pipe as well as possible. No, so there's I don't think that what we would call administrative roles today, like a guy who works in the Misrad HaPnim or the guy who has a position in this governmental office or that governmental office, that's not what it's talking about over here. We're talking about someone who has authority, meaning they have executive authority. They have executive authority over policy decisions. That's what it means. It doesn't mean someone who's hired by the agency to perform a certain role. That could be anyone. We're talking about someone who's like the head of the department. Someone who how would you make that distinction? I guess the devil is in the details, and each case upon its merits. But we're not talking about people that work in the offices. We're talking about the heads of the offices, basically. That's the general distinction. But just to address the question that you raised, because it's an important question, it's important to address these things and to be as explicit as possible. From Chazal and the relevant Mefarshim, there are two general reasons that arise for what the basis of this prohibition of a ger is. Why is it that we can't have a ger? And in a moment, we're going to look at a very, very very interesting example from Jewish history that kind of throws a little bit of a wrench into this whole thing. But before we do that, let's just set out the two reasons that are given. The first reason is in terms of the public perception. Public perception is that we want people to be in charge, that the public that they have authority over can have a certain level of let's say resonance with them. That the public feels that they're amongst them. It's not some outsider that's coming in and running the show, but rather it's from amongst us. And this is very, very important. This is a factor that we need to factor in when we're setting up a government. It's not just, as you said, Bruce, that we want the best guy. For sure, it's important that there are competent people in charge. But the other consideration is that the people that are being ruled over, the people that are being told what the rules are, and they're being, controlled to one extent or another by these people, it's important that they feel a resonance with them. It's very, very important. This is super critical. And if that doesn't exist, then there could be a breakdown in the system as such, not just in terms of the competence of the individuals in the positions, but in the system as a whole, there could be a breakdown. So in order to avoid this problem, there is a blanket prohibition against any foreigner. A ger, as we know, it doesn't just mean a convert in the strict sense. It means any foreigner. It means someone who's not from the Jewish people. That's reason number one. Reason number two, which goes a little bit more to the consideration of the convert, him or herself. And what's that consideration? We want to make sure that the people that are joining the Jewish people are not doing it for any alternative motives. That is a very, very important point. They know that when they come in, they're going to say, listen, you can join, you could be part of this whole operation, you could be part of this whole enterprise, and we love you and we accept you, that's great, but we want to make sure that you understand you're not coming in here in order to be in charge. All right, there's a very well-known story from the Gemara in Shabbat that there's a convert that comes to he comes to Shammai and Hillel. There's a few stories of that, like the convert in the Aretz. First he goes to Shammai and then he goes to Hillel. Right? There's a few stories like that. Right? So one of the stories is that this convert comes to Shammai and says, listen, I want you to convert me on the condition that I can be the high priest. Yeah, so it says that this guy saw the high priest one day, right? This non-Jew, he saw the high priest. He saw the the nice clothes and the tapestries and the gold and the and the crimson that he's wearing and all that. And he says, I would like to be that. So he says, convert me on the condition that I can be the high priest. Now this story just highlights how people can come for alternative motives. Yeah. So in order to avoid that issue completely, we tell the convert, you can come, but you're not going to be in these positions of authority. The ger already takes up.
That story, they have like a gadol door who's a son of a convert.
So it's not, we're going to see in a moment. We're going to see in a moment. It's not only the son of a convert, but it's even right. It's even more than that. Let's just. I just wanted to read out one more source before we get to that. Yeah. So it should be clear that when we say convert, we don't just mean the convert themselves, but we mean the descendant of converts. Meaning this is a linear thing. Meaning once you have a convert, so the descendants of the converts are also invalid. Now the question is this from one parent, or does it have to be from both parents? Meaning, if both parents are converts, then obviously that's a problem. But let's say one of the parents isn't a convert, so are their children invalid? So Tosfos on that Gemara that we just read, that's a Gemara from Yibamot and Daf Kuf Aleph. So Tosfos over there says that either the mother or the father, either the mother or the father can be from the Jewish people. He says, that which it says that the father and the mother have to be non-converts. Perish bi'imo lo sagi achi agam aviv mi Yisrael. It's not enough that his mother is Jewish. His father also has to be Jewish. Aval ba'aviv lechud sagi. But in fact, also with the father alone, it's also enough. Meaning, if the father is a regular Jew, so to speak, and the mother is a convert, that's fine. And what's the biggest raya that Tosfos brings, by the way, that the descendant of a convert woman and a Jewish man is allowed to occupy a position of authority is from Avshalom. Avshalom, we see, despite the fact that he was literally a rebel and that he tried to kill his own father, while at the time that he was in power, he was considered like halachically the king, meaning he got there by illegitimate reasons, but he was in fact the king. The Yerushalmi famously says in Maseches Rosh Hashanah, the Yerushalmi says an incredible thing. It says that while David HaMelech was running away from his son Avshalom, meaning at the time that he had been, dislodged essentially by this coup, so he would not bring the sacrifice of a king. As we know, there are distinctions between certain sacrifices that a regular person brings and the Kohen Gadol brings and the king brings, right? But in order to be in that category, so to speak, that you're a king, that you bring the special sacrifice of a king, you have to be the king. So what's considered the king? The king means that you're in power. That's what it means, right? And if you're right, and even if you were anointed by the prophet, as David was, because he's not in power, so de facto he's not the king. So Avshalom was in fact the king during that period of time. So even though Avshalom's mother was a convert, as it makes clear in the story, right? Avshalom's mother was taken one of the battles that David waged, his many battles in his career as a warrior, and this woman came back and converted, and that was Avshalom's mother. So we see that it's enough that the father is Jewish and the mother is a convert. So just to clarify that. How did David become king? Well, David wasn't the son of a convert woman or man. Oh, you're saying he was the descendant of the convert woman. That's also a very good point. Yes, that's true. That's true. But his actual father and mother were regular Jews, so to speak. So sorry?
We're taught to respect the ger and to honor the ger and here it's really,
respect and honoring the ger does not mean that there can't be restrictions on how the ger operates in society in order to maintain the general cohesion of the entire group. These are sacrifices that the ger makes. Listen, every ger, this is not as relevant today. I mean, hopefully it will be relevant soon, but it was certainly relevant back then. Every convert that came into the Jewish people made a tremendous sacrifice that they had no ancestral land. They had no ancestral land. So you come in to the Jewish people, you're coming into this country, everyone has their little plot that they live off of, that they plant, that they're able to reap the agriculture from. And this ger has nothing. Right? And we're told that we need to help this person. Does that mean that every single Jew needs to like chip in and give a piece of his land away so that this convert can have a piece of land? No, that's not how it works. The ger does take on a certain level of sacrifice in order to be part of the Jewish people. That's why we respect them so much. We respect them because of the sacrifice that they take. If there was no downside, so to speak, if there was no hardship that they take on for themselves in order to join the group, then okay, so it's not such a big deal. But it's from the very fact that they do take on this issue. Right. The first time that this happens, by the way, I don't want to get too far afield, but just to highlight this point because it is an important point. The first time that we find this schism in the Jewish people is way back in Parshas Emor in Sefer Vayikra. We find at the very very end of the parsha that there's this story of the Mekalel, right, the blasphemer, and he goes out, he curses God's name, and he's put to death. Very sad story. All right, and what's the backdrop of this story? As the Psukim already allude to, right? They hint to this, that his mother was Jewish and he was raped by an Egyptian official. So his father is an Egyptian and his mother's Jewish. So he's Jewish technically, right? Not to get into all the details over there because really it was before the Torah was given, and really it should have gone after the father. Like his identity goes after the father. That rule that if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish, that was only after the giving of the Torah. But this person is born in Egypt already. So if your father is Egyptian, that means you're Egyptian. And then that's why Rashi says over there, Melamed Shenisgayer, that he converted. He converted because really he was an Egyptian. He was a total, complete Egyptian. But he decided he's going to convert. So we're talking about like a very special individual. This person, he decided to join a slave nation while they were enslaved. This is before Yetzias Mitzrayim. This is before Moshe came and told them that God is going to take you out with miracles. He decided he's going to join this slave nation. He made that commitment, right? And while they're in the Midbar, so he decides to set up his tent in the tribe of Dan because his mother is from Dan. And the Danites say,
basically Midrash. I mean,
what?
We don't really know. Do you feel that we really know this story?
I think that it is. Well, this is a topic in and of itself. I think that there are many midrashim that give the backdrop story to events in the Torah that we should take as literally true, and there are many examples of this.
Yeah, but we're retrojecting the idea even of conversion. I mean, all we did was this.
What do you mean conversion? Well, it says in the verses explicitly that his mother was Jewish and his father was Egyptian. So what that meant practically is that he was an Egyptian. That's what that means. He's an Egyptian. So how does he join the Jewish people? He decides he's going to join the Jewish people. We call that conversion today in this very technical, like halachic way, but just generally, more broadly, organically, rather speaking, it means he was an Egyptian and he decided he wants to join the Jewish people. That's what that means. And the whole backstory about how, he's the guy that Moshe kills and all that. Okay, fine. You want to accept those details. You don't want to accept those details. The point is that we do see that this is the general story of this person. That he was an Egyptian and he decided that he wanted to join the Jewish people. And the whole discussion that ensues over there, people can look this up in their own time. At the end of Parshas Emor, so they bring this person after he curses the name of God. They bring this person to Moshe because they don't know what to do with him. Again, this is all in the verses. This is not midrash. They bring the person to Moshe. They don't know what to do with him. So Moshe comes. His response is the following. His response is to give them a whole lecture on the laws of civil damages, right? If your ox gores a guy, then you have to pay. But if he kills someone, you have to kill the ox, right? Etc. Right? He just goes into all this stuff about civil law that seemingly doesn't have anything to do with anything that we're talking about. Okay, but it's the last line, which is the punchline, so to speak. He says, "Mishpat echad yeh lachem." You will have one law amongst you, kager ka'ezrach va'aretz. The regular citizen and the foreigner are treated the same. That's the end of his whole lecture. So it's this whole lecture on civil law that ends off with this one line, and that's why he's bringing it up. He's saying, listen, it's true that this guy was a convert. It's true. He's a foreigner. That's true. And it's also true that he doesn't have a portion in a particular tribe because his father is not from the Jewish people, and your tribe goes through the patrilineal descent. But you couldn't have found some solution for this guy? You couldn't have found some solution for him? So it's like, right, it's speaking out this schism. The reason that I brought up this story now is because it is highlighting this, right, this fact, right? It is very, very difficult to be a convert, right? I'm sure we all know converts, and right, to various degrees they have their challenges of, right, integrating into the Jewish people. And it's because of those challenges that we respect them. It's not because it's easy, it's because it's hard.
Are we blaming Moshe for some kind of a fallacy here? I mean, Moshe supposedly assigns land near Jericho for the followers of his father-in-law. whole parcel.
Right. That's true. He gives them dushna shel Yericho. Yeah. So it seems that was a very special case because Jethro and his, it's not so clear if it was his father-in-law or his brother-in-law, but be there as it may, that because that family of Midianites was very unique, they provided assistance to the Jewish people while they were in the desert. So to that particular family of converts, and it's not so clear if they were even converts or they were like with the Jewish people, it seems the pshat of the psukim in Sefer Shmuel that they weren't actual converts. That's also how Chazal described them. They weren't really converts. They were this minority of people living amongst the Jewish people, right? So is
it a stain on each Beit Din of every Shabbat that not one of them could find?
Somewhere. Yes, it is. And yes, it absolutely is. And you can ask Rabbi Kowalski the next time that he speaks with you guys, because he has a whole thing on this, which he explained to me at length, that this incident occurred with the Danites. That he went to, the tribe of Dan, and he said, listen, my mother's from Dan, I want to set up shop here. And they said, yeah, well, your father is a guy, so get out. So, right? So later on in history, we see that the Danites in Sefer Shoftim, in the book of Judges, they have a huge crisis with their territory. If you remember that in the book of Judges, they're not able to conquer their whole territory that was allotted to them by Joshua, and they have to send out this marauding party of like 600 bandits essentially to go steal whatever they can steal, basically. So it's like this major crisis for the tribe of Dan that they don't have a place, which is why their
grandson is sort of the punishment to, even though we're not supposed to punish descendants for the ancestors' behavior, but in a way Moshe is punished that his grandson. That's
another character in the story. That's another character in the story. The Menashe, right, the son of Menashe, so to speak, right, the Levite. So he's like the priest, the Avodah Zarah priest that they kind of take along. I'm just focusing on the Danites themselves. You have this marauding tribe of Danites. Why are they walking around the land like this? It's because they don't have enough of a place in their own allotted territory. So it's because they initiated this bad trait already in the desert that they couldn't find a place for someone who was desperate. So they themselves suffered from this problem. So it's what goes around comes around. If you begin with this type of behavior, so the pattern perpetuates and comes back to affect you. This is what the Torah is saying. Very, very important lesson. So I just wanted to move on and focus on this interesting point. Bruce he already alluded to this, that we see very often. We see explicitly in Chazal that there were great sages that were connected in some way to the family of converts. Now I want to hone in on one particular example because it's really, really quite fascinating. This particular example, the Gemara in Onkelos is probably the most famous, but there it's explicit. Onkelos Hager, he's called Onkelos the convert, so that's not particularly controversial. But this is an interesting example and has very, very serious implications, as we'll see. So the Gemara in Baba Basra gives a few interesting examples of the descendants of such and such wicked person ended up being great sages. So it says the great grandchild of Haman ended up teaching the Torah in Bnei Brak, and it lists who that individual was. And one of the examples that it gives, it says Bnei Banav Shel Sancheriv, that the descendants of Sancheriv, the Assyrian king, who came and almost conquered Jerusalem, they ended up teaching Torah in Jerusalem. So says the Gemara, who were these descendants of Sancheriv that taught Torah in Jerusalem? These were Shmaya and Avtalion. Shmaya and Avtalion were the descendants of the Assyrian king, and they ended up being great sages and leaders of the Jewish people. So I want to focus here on the opinion of the Rambam regarding this statement. So there are two sources, just very, very quickly. It's one line from each one. So the first one is the source. Is the introduction rather to Mishnah Torah. So over here, the Rambam, he just kind of peruses over this thing, and he says, hold on, wait, this is the wrong one, right? And he's listing the different sages that exist in the time of the early Tanaic period. Mehen Rabban Gamliel, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, all of these Mibnei Shfatia ben Avtiel ben David. All of these were from the royal family, the descendants of David. Ve'ele Shiva Chachamim Kvar Yisbar Shehem Mizera David. All these sages that we listed, they were all from the house of David. Umehem Arba Mikahal Hagerim. But there were four other very, very famous sages that were from the community. That's literally what that means. Kahal, the community of converts. Shmaya, Avtalion, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Meir. those very four famous sages who were like the leaders of the generation, okay, they were from the community of converts. So here the Rambam doesn't specify what he means when he says community of converts. The Gemara says explicitly that Rabbi Akiva's father Yosef was a convert, and it also says by Rabbi Meir that his grandfather or great grandfather was like a Roman official, perhaps even related to the emperor, but he himself was not a convert. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir were for sure not converts. That's what the Gemara says explicitly. But Shammai and Avtalion he leaves kind of ambiguous. However, in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, not the introduction to the Mishnah, the Rambam says explicitly right over here, Shmaya v'Avtalion gerei hatzedek. Shmaya and Avtalion were Assyrian converts, which is unbelievable. And it's unbelievable for two reasons. First of all, the Gemara we don't find in Chazal explicitly that they say such a thing, whereby other times they do, right? Like by Unclus Hager, for example, they call him Unclus the convert. Shmai and Avtalion, they don't call them Shmai and Avtalion the converts. But the other reason why it's so fascinating is, who were Shmai and Avtalion? Who were these people? So they were one of the zugot, one of the pairs. There was many generations of Jewish people where the Jewish people were led. The top two sages, they were pairs. One was the Nasi, functioned as like the president, which had some type of pseudo political status, and the Av Beit Din, the head of the Sanhedrin. Those were the zugot. One guy was the Nasi, one guy was the head of the Sanhedrin. Now, can you be the head of the Sanhedrin if you're a convert? You can't be the head of the Sanhedrin. You can't even be a regular guy in the Sanhedrin. You can't even be on a regular Beit Din if you're a convert. So how can the Rambam say that Shmai and Avtalion were both converts when they both officiated on the highest court in the land? This is an unbelievable question. This one little comment of the Rambam has generated many theories about how to reconcile this. So one answer that's given by the Knesset Hagdolah, which is an important compilation of different achronim on the order of the Shulchan Aruch. So he brings an interesting answer. It may sound a little bit forced, but it does have basis in Chazal, as we'll see in a moment. The Knesset Hagdolah says an interesting answer. He says that there is a din that we learn in the Gemara and Sanhedrin of kiblu alayhu. What does that mean? It means that even if a dayan is technically invalid and he's not allowed to be, by the strict letter of the law, he's not allowed to officiate as a judge, if the two litigants agree that they're willing to accept this person as the judge, then he can be the judge. So let's say, the example that the Gemara gives is that, if you have two litigants and the father of one of them is a big Talmud Chacham. So they said, Kiblu alay avicha, right? So the litigant says, okay, I accept your father to be the judge in our case. I accept him, right? Even though he's your father and technically a person who's related to one of the litigants is invalid, I accept him. So you're allowed to accept him. So the Knesset Hagdolah says an unbelievable thing. He says that Shmaya and Avtalion were accepted organically and unanimously by the entire Jewish people. Now, this might sound a little bit strange, and I agree that it does sound a little bit far-fetched. However, when we see the description in Chazal of Shmaya and Avtalion about who they were and the persona that they had and how the Jewish people related to them, it sounds a lot less far-fetched. The Gemara talks about, for example, a story when Shmaya and Avtalion were walking through the streets of Jerusalem, and the Kohen Gadol was walking from the other direction. And the whole community of Jerusalem was walking behind the Kohen Gadol, and then they all spotted Shmaya and Avtalion, and in mass, like pack rats, they all ran away from the Kohen Gadol in order to accompany Shmaya and Avtalion, because they were just beloved figures. For some reason, Shmaya and Avtalion were just these beloved, likable people. They didn't have any controversy surrounding them. Everyone just loved and respected them. So this idea that there was this organic acceptance of them as the leaders of the Jewish people, despite the fact that they were converts, does not sound so far-fetched. However, it does sound a little bit forced, because how could you say that they took a poll like every single Jew in the land of Israel at that time accepted Shmaya and Avtalion? So it does seem a little bit far-fetched. The other answer that I heard,
you could say that there was no public protest, and therefore by default. Correct.
Yes, that's actually a very good answer. Right. There's a shuv of the Chassam Sofer that talks about this. Someone sent him a question regarding a vote, a community vote that took place in the shul one week, and like 20 people showed up to the vote. Like, not too many people showed up, and on the basis of the vote of 20 people, they made a decision. So a bunch of people that protested and they said, wait a minute, only 20 guys showed up. Like, what about the rest of us that didn't show up? So says the Chassam Sofer, if there was an announcement that there was going to be a vote on this critical issue and everyone knew about it and everyone had the opportunity to show up, the people that showed up, they're the majority. So, right? It's decided on the basis of the people that show up. It's kind of like an election, right? The people that decide to vote, so those are the people that determine the outcome of the election.
Kuli Alma might be the two guys sitting there discussing the topic.
Yeah. Listen. I mean, you're talking about when the Gemara says like Kuli Alma. There it is kind of giving a broad view of like the consensus of scholarship at the time, like the whole, like all the people sitting in the yeshiva. I think how you're applying it now, that when you have a decision that needs to be made for the public, and the public have the opportunity to protest or weigh in or give their opinion, and they don't. So that is tacit agreement. That's like tacit acceptance of the situation, which could be very relevant. There's another very, very important...
From a line of converts, so it's not direct. I mean, like...
So you could say that, which is, again, it kind of jives more with how the Gemara portrays the lineage of Shammai and Avtalion, because it doesn't say that they themselves were converts. However, the Rambam says that he has a tradition that Shammai and Avtalion were themselves converts, which is really fascinating. The other answer, which is very, very important, which highlights a theme that we've touched on in the past, is an answer that's given by the Urim V'Tumim, Rav Yonasan Eibeshetz. We mentioned Rav Yonasan Eibeshetz last week, and I didn't have the details off the top of my head. Rav Yonasan Eibeshetz was an important figure in the early to mid 1700s. He was the chief rabbi of Prague, right? Both a mystic and a very important halachic decider in the Jewish people. So Urim V'Tumim was the book that he wrote on Choshen Mishpat, and he gives a very, very interesting answer as to how Shammai and Avtalion could officiate in their positions. So he says like this. He says the Zugot were not these rabbis that functioned as the pairs throughout Jewish history. You had Shammai and Hillel, Shammai and Avtalion, all these people. So they weren't regular dayanim that just happened to occupy a position on the Beit Din. They were much more like political figures, and because the political situation of the Jewish people at that time was essentially a vassal state of the Persian Empire or the Greeks or whoever happened to live there, so essentially they were being appointed for political positions. They were being appointed for political positions. Okay, and when you're being appointed for a political position, so if the non-Jewish authorities appoint you within their system of governance, so you're allowed to officiate in that capacity, right? To be a dayan, to be like a regular dayan on a regular Beit Din, it's true. A convert is not allowed to occupy that position. But because these were essentially political positions and not really the classical dayan, like someone who helps convene a Beit Din, so that's why Shammai and Avtalion were allowed to occupy the positions that they were in. Which is a very interesting answer for a number of reasons. First of all, it sheds a lot of light on what that means when we say, the Zugot, the pairs, one of them was the head of the Beit Din and one of them was the Nasi. Like it gives some almost like some geopolitical insight into what the actual...
Well, I would thought just the opposite, because of the geopolitics involved.
Yeah.
You can't have the Nasi, which is like the prime minister, representing the Jews, now being as head of the yeshiva. So you'd think likewise, and maybe on a regular Beit Din, possibly on halacha, that might make sense, but a political role who represents the Am Yisrael, it's shocking that that's what I'm saying. They must have come from a line of descendants.
So I'll tell
because the only illusion we have is that one comment. There's that one line you read, and someone who didn't like them made that comment. It was a little bit rude.
Which comment?
The guy that says, you're sons of converts.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but it also I think it also reveals like what the role of the Sanhedrin was, because the Sanhedrin itself wasn't a court that was functioning day in and day out in like regular disputes. You have like a regular Beit Din of a town, so like they're dealing with the day in and day out responsibilities of people that live in that area and like their daily issues. The Sanhedrin was not dealing with that type of stuff. They were like the Supreme Court, in a way. That's a pretty good comparison. The actual cases that they took were very, very few and far between. the Sanhedrin was not functioning as a regular court that was just taking cases all the time.
The Supreme Court members, that they should be, full blood. I mean, what do you want to call it? Full blood Jews.
Listen, I hear you. Which is why I think that the first answer that we saw before of the Knesset Gedola, that it was just that they were so popular, that these two individuals, for one reason or another, they were just so beloved and so popular that there was just no opposition whatsoever to their being appointed to this role, right? Ad kidei kach that we see that that Hillel Hazaken, who was a direct descendant of David, he went and studied under these people. That's what the Gemara in Pesachim tells us, that Hillel was, he was from Babylonia originally, Hillel. He comes from Babylonia to Israel in order to study under these people. Because
we know under the Roman times, the Jews bought and sold the Kahuna, Kohen Gadol.
That's true. These were, this was before that. This was before that situation. Like one or two generations. Yeah.
It's not before Pompey conquered Jerusalem.
Is it before? No, it's not before Pompey conquered it.
No?
I don't know exactly when Chazal saw the Kahuna Gedola descending into a purely political appointment. I don't think it was immediately after the Roman occupation. I don't know. I just don't know enough about the topic.
It could be anti-Hasmonium. But the point being, it's really a poke at the Kohen Gadol more so than a perk to these descendants of converts.
Well, I think that in either way, it's trying to demonstrate the point of Chazal when they bring that story is not only to poke at the Kohen Gadol, but it's also to show the reverence that people had for these people. Listen, if the people were willing to take the time in order to show their reverence for a guy who was a puppet of the Roman government out of fear of reprisal, so if they took the time to do that. And when they see Shammai and Avtalion walking down the street, they all leave in order to show reverence to them. That I think does show the position, so to speak, that these people occupied, that these people played. I think just in the popular conception, they were just beloved, respected individuals, and that's how they were able to occupy this position, right? So I think these two ideas of the Knesset Gedola, of this incredible popularity and respect that Shammai and Avtalion had, coupled with this idea that Rav Arbeshetz gives us that when we have a position that has a pseudo political authority, so the rules are slightly different. I think that this sheds light on this approach. I think that it's also important to highlight that I saw recently in the Maharal in his commentary on Maseches Avos that he says. He actually brings this opinion of the Rambam, that Shammai and Avtalion were themselves converts. And the Maharal says, not possible. It's just totally not possible. I don't know how anyone in their right mind could suggest such a thing. Chazal don't say that that's the case. It says that they were the descendants of the Assyrian king, but it doesn't say that they themselves were Assyrian converts. So, okay, we could right. You could take it or leave it. It certainly doesn't seem to be the prevalent approach. Who Shammai and Avtalion were, but what's important for our discussion is that all of these ideas that have been generated in order to respond to the Rambam's opinion are relevant because they do shed light on the more theoretical aspects of the conversation about how converts function or don't function within the context of a Beit Din.
Do we have a hint of this today in the way that FFBs might relate to converts, children of converts, when it comes to shidduchim, that somehow they ascribe something that's not 100%.
Listen, I think it's important. I think it's important to be explicit about these things. There are some considerations that people have that are petty, and some considerations that aren't petty. The Gemara in Yevamos, not the same Gemara that we quoted before, but an earlier one, makes the very seemingly harsh comment that Kashin Gerim L'Yisrael Kasapachas. That the Jewish people are difficult. That converts are difficult for the Jewish people, like a leprosy lesion. Okay, that's not putting it lightly. That's pretty hard. So there's different understandings of what this means. Okay, so I believe Rabbeinu Bachai says, and this is Rabbeinu Bachai, he says that one of the aspects of why it's so difficult is kind of like kind of like a Yonah situation, like he runs away from Nineveh because he doesn't want to make the Jewish people look bad. It's like these converts, they come from idolaters, right? They grow up in churches, what have you, right? They're like worshiping idols, and they wake up one day, it's like, no, this is all sheker. I'm going to worship the one true God of Israel. So that makes the Jews look bad, and it kind of does. You see, right? I remember years ago listening to a convert. I believe his name is Whitman. He was a doctor of theology of all things. He studied theology in Germany, and he was a pastor for many years, like a real hardcore idol worshiper. And one day he woke up. He's like, I want to be Jewish. So he's and one day he's talking to one of his old pastor buddies back from Germany, and he's talking to him about the lies of the New Testament and the Christian doctrine, etc., etc. And the pastor friend says to him, he says, okay, answer me one question and I'll come with you to be Jewish. Answer me one question. Why don't the Jews take this seriously? And he didn't have an answer for him. Huh? So it's like these people who come and they're taking it seriously. They had no reason to take it seriously, but out of their own volition, they take it extremely seriously. They kind of make us look bad. So that's one perspective. But the other perspective, which is a little bit more simple, which is what Tosfos says on the spot, it says, listen, these people come in very often with certain cultural baggage, cultural background that doesn't necessarily comport with what is normal in amongst the Jewish community. Now, is that a blanket statement on every single convert that we're automatically going to judge them for that? Absolutely not. Chas v'shalom, right? God forbid that we should cast judgment on an individual because of the possible trends of a certain phenomenon. That's called stereotyping. I'm sure we've all heard of that idea, right? So obviously not. The mitzvah, by the way, the mitzvah that's mentioned the most in the entire Torah. This is ammunition for people with a certain political bent, but it happens to be true. The mitzvah that mentioned in the Torah the most is to take care of the ger. I believe it's mentioned 36 times in the Torah. That's a lot. It's more. It's more right. It's more than Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's more than learning Torah. It's mentioned a lot, right? So it's a big thing.
How would the Syrian community, as a whole community, say we do not take?
No, so that's a very good question. Very good question. And the historical backdrop to this was that there were many instances, not just one or two. There was a whole trend of people that were bringing in, which were essentially goyim in order to marry them, and going through a kangaroo court of conversion in order to just seal the deal. So they made this blanket prohibition. Perhaps you can critique it to say that the situation is different today than it was back then. Okay, fine. So maybe that's a relevant critique. But the source or the origin rather of this blanket ban has very, very strong precedent in terms of what was going on in the community at the time. The Gemara says, this is slightly more well known. The Gemara says that in the time of Mashiach, we won't accept converts. In the time of Shlomo HaMelech, he didn't accept converts either. Why not? Because all the people were coming in order to just join the party. Things were so good that it was clear that people weren't doing it lishma. Again, we can question. We can
go to a Beit Din and say my child is not being allowed into this school because we're converts, and the school admits it. Sure, that's the reason. Is that actionable?
So I don't think that such a thing is actionable from the perspective of Beit Din. From what angle would you be able to make such a lawsuit? Perhaps you could say that if the school is a communal, you could say that if the school is a communal facility, and the people that live in that community and function in that community and are part of the community for all other aspects, they have a right to be there. So in that sense, it could be actionable, but outside of that, I would think it would be very, very difficult for it to be really solidly actionable from the perspective of a Beit Din. I do think that communities, and this has happened in the past, the communities can make policy decisions. Right, collectively, they can decide to make policy decisions on their institutions and say, "Listen, we do not discriminate, on the basis of this or this." And if you do, then you're violating the the bylaws of the city. It's not a Beit Din issue; it's a communal issue, and that absolutely should be done. Again, this goes back to the story that we mentioned in the book of Vayikra that talks about this ger situation. That technically speaking, the people were right. Listen, his father is an Egyptian; he has no right being here. So technically, they're 100% right. Okay, fine, you're technically right, but you can't find a solution for this guy. Really, you can't figure out a place for him to pitch his tent. How much space are we talking over here? Okay, 4 square meters, 5 square meters, right? So they're technically right. They're technically right, and that's what the Midrash says. Yatsa mi beis dino shel Moshe Rabbeinu. He leaves the court of Moshe. Moshe rules against him. He's saying, "Listen, I want a place to put my tent," and Moshe rules against him. He says, "Listen, you don't have a spot because your father's an Egyptian." So he ruled against him. And still, there was this tremendous kitrug, so to speak, on the Jewish people, this tremendous judgment against the Jewish people that they couldn't find a solution for this guy. So this speaks to the general theme. Again, we keep on coming back to this theme. I think it's important to emphasize it over and over again, how we should not conflate the fundamental righteousness of the society with how Beit Din functions. Beit Din functioning is a tool, one of the tools that society has in order to function well. But to think that the Beit Din is going to be the end-all, be-all of making a just society, that's having way too much faith in the system. And as we're told time and time again, it's our initiative that ends up keeping tzedakah and mishpat in the world. And Bezrat Hashem, all these things should remain theoretical anyway, so we won't have to resort to Beit Din, and we can just work things out in the most organic way possible. Bezrat Hashem. Tov. Till next time, guys.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.